Thank you. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you all for coming. It's always nice to have a chance to talk about flamingos, and especially for folks who are in a place where there's so much excitement for flamingos right now. Um, I'll get started. You know, the way I think about flamingos is that they are the most Florida bird. Flamingos in Florida themselves are pretty rare, but you can see flamingo imagery everywhere. Um, they're on postcards. Parks are named after them. They're the symbol for the Florida Lotto. So it's really surprising that despite this, flamingos themselves in Florida have been rare for a really long time. Um, just to introduce the species, I'll be talking about the American flamingo today. This is one of 6 species of flamingos around the world, and they occur throughout the Caribbean. So the symbols on the map here, the orange circles are places where there's nesting populations of American flamingos today, and the red triangles are places where the flamingos have been extirpated. There used to be a lot more flamingo populations around the Caribbean, but many of them have been wiped out by hunting throughout the range. So I really got involved with this because shortly after I started at Zoo Miami, this flamingo appeared at the Naval Air Station in Key West. And for flamingos to be such an iconic species, it was really surprising that a flamingo showing up at all would make a newspaper. But this article really addressed some of really important questions. Why is this flamingo here? Where did it come from? Do flamingos belong here? And is there a conservation story here at all? So this flamingo landed in kind of a bad place. If you see the image on the right, this is an aerial view of the Naval Air Station. And you can see the runways kind of crisscrossing and these shallow wetlands between them. And those shallow wetlands where this flamingo was hanging out. And typically it's bad for birds to be on airfields. So the Naval Air Station had someone, Rosa Maria Gonzalez is her name, whose job is to make sure that birds stay off the runways. And typically, if there's a bird that hangs out too long, she'll go and harass it, try to get it to go away. And ultimately, for a lot of species of birds, if they won't leave, they'll end up shooting them so that they, don't cause a plane crash. But no one wants to shoot a flamingo. And so Zoo Miami was contacted and asked to see if we could come rescue the flamingo. Fortunately, because we work at a zoo, we have flamingo crates on hand. So a couple of us headed down to the naval station, the Naval Air Base, to see if we could rescue this flamingo. So here's an image of kind of the situation we were dealing with. This is the flamingo in the shallow wetland. There were really strong winds, and it was clear that we didn't really have the equipment or the experience from the zoo team to capture this flamingo ourselves. So we reached out to Thomas Sweets, who works at the Key West Wildlife Center, and he does a lot of work capturing injured birds and rehabbing them. And this is him in the back left. You can see standing there. The way he captures injured birds is with a air-powered net gun. So it fires a small net at short range based on compressed air. And this is a pretty safe way to capture birds. There's always some risk of injury, and there's always risk when you're capturing birds over water. But this was the method we had that we thought was going to best work with flamingos. Sorry, I have a cat here who really wants to be on video. So the Naval Air Station had to shut down their flights while we were trying to capture this flamingo. They had work to do, and we were a little bit disruptive. So they told us that we only had a few days to try to capture this flamingo because it had already been there for a while. And at some point, they were just going to have to kick us out and they were going to shoot the bird. So on our third and final day, after trying a lot of things, um, we had Thomas. Thomas was hiding in the vegetation. The yellow circle you see there is the cap of the net gun. And this is Conchy. This is a photo that Rosa Maria from USDA took um, uh, as we were trying to push Conchy within range of the net gun closer and closer to Thomas. And this is a photo that was taken just before we got the flamingo into the net. I keep calling this bird Conchy because that's what we actually named him. So we removed Conchy from the Naval Air Station. He stayed at the Key West Wildlife Center for a little while he was while we were trying to figure out how to release him. And our plan was to release him in Everglades National Park because a couple other flamingos were there at the same time. And there was some thought that those flamingos had arrived to Key West with him and then taken off. However, when we asked FWC for permits to release the flamingo, they told us, well, silly biologists, flamingos aren't native to Florida, so you can't go around releasing non-native species. And here on the bottom right, I have a screenshot of FWC's webpage where they describe flamingos as a non-native species. And so this was really surprising, but I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about flamingos before I was wrapped into this project. And FWC's argument was that flamingos in Florida today are escapes from captive populations. And the place that they were primarily concerned with is the Hialeah racetrack. So the flamingos were introduced to the Hialeah racetrack in Miami in the 1930s, and they started breeding soon afterwards. But there are a lot of places around Florida that have held flamingos through the 1900s. I have just a short list of them here, but I'm sure there were many more. I'm sure there were a lot of private collections as well. So FWC's argument was that flamingos are just escaping from places like Hialeah. However, this was really in contrast with a report from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which did an assessment of wading bird conservation priorities in 2006. And they actually came to the conclusion that flamingos are native to Florida, and because there's so few of them, we need to do some conservation work to help bring the species back. And Florida is a really interesting place because there's lots of rare and endangered species, and there's lots of non-native species as well. But usually we know which is which. And the management strategies for these two species couldn't be more different, right? For endangered species, you want to help them recover. For invasive species, you want to remove them or control them. And so it was really a strange issue that we didn't know where flamingos stood. And part of the problem was that no one had really just spent the time to think about flamingos for more than 50 years. The last real assessment of flamingos in the US was by Bob Allen, and it was published in 1956. And so no one had really been thinking about flamingos as a conservation issue, as an invasive species issue, any of it. So I decided to do a deep dive into the real history of flamingos in Florida. I love looking into accounts by old naturalists. And so I did a deep dive to see what I could find out in the primary literature, what was really out there about flamingos back in the day. And the earliest account of flamingos I could find was by John Lee Williams. Just after Florida was acquired by the US government sent John Lee Williams basically to do a survey for natural resources in Florida. And one of the natural resources that he was interested in was birds. So down at the bottom left here, he describes American flamingos. He describes them, just their physical appearance. And he says that they were really common around Tampa. And if you look at the last sentence here, he says they are excellent food. So that was around 1827. In 1832, Audubon himself was looking for flamingos and came down to the Florida Keys. He remarks that he saw flamingos there in 2 flocks, but he wasn't able to collect any, which is what he was really after. So that's the earliest records from the 1830s. Around the 1850s, the Smithsonian Institution in DC sent down Gustavus Orderman to look for flamingos and actually bring some back to the collection at the Smithsonian. And he has a really detailed account of going out with a hunter from Key West who was able to capture more than 100 flamingos in a day, which is pretty impressive. In the later 1800s, the plume trade emerges in South Florida. And while people earlier in the 1800s described hunting flamingos for food, it seems like by around 1870, the real interest in hunting flamingos became for its feathers, for their feathers. So there's not a lot of real written accounts from plume trade hunters, but one of those that's gotten a lot of attention is The Cruise of the Bonton by Charlie Pierce. And he actually went out with plume hunters and remarked on seeing flamingos on that trip and noted that the plume hunters valued flamingos more than any other species of bird. A flamingo carcass could bring in $25, whereas the next most valuable bird was a white pelican, which was worth $10. So it's easy to see that economic incentive for folks to hunt flamingos at that time. In the later 1800s, more of what we'd consider serious naturalists or serious scientists come down to South Florida. And William E.D. Scott and Reginald Howe had really important accounts of flamingos that go into a lot more detail. And one of the things that's really interesting about these accounts in the late 1800s or early 1900s is that they start to describe overhunting and they start to describe a conservation concern. But this account by Reginald Howe in 1902, he says that he saw 500 to 1,000 birds east of Cape Sable. This is probably the part of Everglades National Park that we call Snake Bite today. This is the last account of a flock of flamingos that size that we've seen in Florida. So all of these accounts together really seem to show a decline in population of birds, firmly established that flamingos were historically present, and describe concern that they were being overhunted. We also wanted to look and see if there was physical evidence. So these written accounts are important, but sometimes people mistake flamingos and for example, spoonbills. So I did a search through natural history museum specimens, and I was able to come up with a long list of flamingo specimens that were collected in Florida, mostly during the 1800s. And some of these, including the ones by Verdeman, were animals where, he describes hunting for those specimens. So we have a physical specimen in a natural history museum tied to a written account of where that specimen came from. So this seems like really conclusive data and physical evidence still that flamingos were present. There was also a lot of suspicion about whether flamingos nested in Florida. And when we started this project, the best evidence we had was from Alexander Sprunt, an ornithologist in the early 1900s. And someone told Sprunt that they saw a group of flamingos sitting on whitish stumps in the lower Keys. Flamingos don't really sit on stumps, but what Sprunt interpreted that as flamingos sitting on their mud nests, where they're really whitewashed from all of the flamingos pooping on the sides of the nest. So that's not really conclusive, but just like we looked through the Natural History Museum specimen databases to find those birds in museums, we were also able to look for egg records. And this is kind of crazy, but in the late 1800s, oology, or collecting eggs and data associated with them, was a pretty popular hobby. Um, Naturalists would collect the eggs, take details on the kinds of habitats they were found in, the time of year, and this has become a really important scientific record. A lot of what we know about DDT and eggshell thinning actually comes from this series of egg collections, because people were able to trace back that eggshells are getting thinner and thinner, and based on the type of birds that were suffering from eggshell thinning, they were able to trace that back to DDT. And it turns out that we were able to find 4 different events where flamingo eggs were collected in South Florida in the 1880s. So each of these is in a different natural history museum. Each has a different collector who collected the eggs and came from a different year. So none of these, unfortunately, is very specific about where exactly in South Florida they came from. This one, the second from the right, actually says that it was from Tampa, which is fascinating because we have that early account in the 1820s of lots of flamingos in the Tampa area, but certainly not a lot from the late 1800s uh, or the last 100 years. So collectively, when we put this historical evidence together, we see that the naturalists describe an estimate of 1,000 to 2,500 flamingos in a single flock. And there could have been multiple flocks in different areas where they're not seeing the entire Florida population at once. We have accounts from naturalists really throughout the year, which suggests they're not just seasonal migrants to South Florida, but historically they were sticking around. These accounts point to extirpation by around 1900, and they're clear evidence, the extirpation is under clear evidence of hunting for meat and feathers. So this does not at all look like flamingos or a non-native species. Instead, what this looks like is the same kind of population history as for Florida panthers, for manatees, for sea turtles, for crocodiles, all of which are species that are protected by state and federal endangered species laws. So we were able to give some of this information to FWC in order to encourage them that at least we should be allowed to release Conchy and figure out where flamingos come from, learn a little bit about their biology. Oh, and sorry, before I get into that, the other thing that we wanted to do was look at recent population trends. So we knew that flamingos have been wiped out by around 1900, but we wanted to know what the trends were since then. Now it's really easy to go into databases like eBird and look for all the flamingo records in Florida, for example. It was a lot more difficult in the past. In the days before eBird, folks would write in rare bird observations to Audubon field notes, and they would get compiled in physical book form. And so I went through this series of Audubon field notes from 1950 until I think the mid 1990s, looking for observations of flamingos in Florida. We also used Audubon's Christmas bird count, which is a really good community science database that goes back more than 100 years. And this allowed us to put together population trends of flamingos in Florida from 1950 to 2016. So when we look at that, these are the data here, and I don't have the last few years updated, but I will do that soon. Any way you look at this, you see an increase in the number of flamingos over time. So A is the number of flamingo observations, just the number of people who reported flamingos. B is the total number of flamingos observed, and then C is the maximum group size, the largest flock of flamingos seen in a given year. So all of those metrics show that flamingos are increasing in Florida over this time period. And so what we were able to tell is that flamingos were extirpated, but are increasing in numbers. And that could either be more flamingos coming back from around the Caribbean, or it could be more and more flamingos escaping from Hialeah every year. And there are really three ways we could work to try to figure this out. Banding records, stable isotopes, four, sorry, population genetics, or satellite telemetry. And so you all are familiar with bird banding, where birds are collected, usually as chicks, put bands on their legs, and then released. And we were able to find, at this point, 3 birds that had been banded that showed up in Florida. And all 3 of these came from the Yucatan of Mexico. So it's clear that at least some birds in Florida were native to Florida, or were actual wild birds. Another method that we wanted to use was stable isotopes. And so stable isotopes are different forms of elements that are naturally occurring. And they're actually a really useful tool for ecology, as well as for things like crime scene forensics. So different isotopes of elements occur in different places around nature in a predictable way. So for example, if I had a hair sample from everyone in this talk, I could do some analysis and tell you who eats meat versus who's a vegetarian. I could tell you who eats a lot of seafood versus who only eats food grown on land. And I could tell you who lives in Florida year round versus who moves from place to place over time. And so this is actually really useful for ecology because you can try to understand where organisms come from. And so I collected feathers from the Bahamas, from wild birds in the Bahamas, from captive birds at Zoo Miami, at Hialeah, and some other places around Florida. And we did some chemistry magic to try to find out if we can tell wild birds and captive birds apart. And so I crunched all of that data into this figure here, where the purple dots you see are the isotopic signatures of wild birds, and the green points are of birds that were raised in human care. And you can see they're really easy to separate, right? The orange points, in contrast, are birds of unknown origin. So these are all birds from Florida, and we don't really know where they're from. Conchy is here. This EVER 1834 is a bird that was found dead on Card Sound Road. There's several birds from Snake Bite, where a very intrepid field technician followed around a flock of flamingos and picked up feathers as they shed them. And then this one on the far left is a bird that came from the Dry Tortugas, I think in 2018, flew in and ultimately passed away there. So this shows that there's probably a mix of wild and captive birds based on the isotope evidence. We were also able to use population genetics. So we sampled wild birds from throughout the range of the flamingos, and we used samples from flamingos in zoos as well. A master's student at the University of Central Florida named Jessica Folsom did this work for her master's thesis. And basically what she found is that all of the flamingos in the wild populations are one big population. So there's a lot of mixing between, for example, Mexico and the Yucatan, all throughout the range. And she found that flamingos in zoos, the captive population that zoos collectively manage, can't be distinguished from wild birds in any way. So this is really useful because her evidence suggests that we could use zoo-raised birds for reintroduction efforts, and that wouldn't disrupt the natural genetics found in the Caribbean. So we were able to present a lot of this information, convince the state that flamingos are native, and they did allow us to release Conchy in 2015. And this is where we get to satellite telemetry, the really fun way to figure out where flamingos come from. So we released Conchy to see where flamingos in Florida are coming from. And what we expected is that within a few days or maybe a few weeks, he would leave Florida and either fly to Cuba or fly to the Bahamas or fly to the Yucatan. But in that, Conchy was an absolute failure because he decided to stick around in Florida for at least 2 years. You can see he's got this blue band US-01 and the radio transmitter. This is the same model of transmitter that was used on peaches, I think that many of you all are familiar with. But the map on the right shows every data point we had for Conchy over this 2-year period. After about 2 years, Conchy's transmitter started to work less and less. We would get fewer and fewer points. So it's pretty common for these transmitters to have a lifespan. And 2 years was, we were pretty happy to get 2 years of data. And so while Conchy didn't tell us where flamingos come from, what he did tell us is where flamingos will hang out in Everglades National Park. So you see here this big cluster of points, and this big orange blob. That's Snake Bite by the Flamingo Visitor Center. This is probably the best place at any point in time to see flamingos in Florida. It's where we have a lot of the historic evidence for flamingos occurring as well. But then these 3 little islands, these Club Island Key, Bob Allen Key #4, and Stake Key, were not really places that we expected to see flamingos. And each of these is really interesting because it's kind of a shallow salt pond surrounded by mangroves. So if you went by one of these islands on a boat, you would never be able to see inside past the mangroves and know that flamingos are there. So Conchy was really useful at telling us about where flamingos, live and how long they might stay in Florida Bay. Here's a few photos of the kinds of habitats that Conchy was using. These kind of coastal mudflats, these mud banks that kind of divide between islands, and then the bottom right is the interior of one of these islands. Conchy also gave us lots of data on group size for flamingos. Conchy kind of developed a cult following among bird watchers. And so people would send us photos of Conchy with other birds, which was really useful because we knew that he wasn't alone. We knew that he was with more and more flamingos each time we saw him. So ultimately, Conchy told us that flamingos are living in Florida for multiple years, which is something we never would have guessed at the time. He also provided a lot of information on the kinds of habitats that flamingos use and the amount of habitat they would need to survive there. He didn't tell us anything about connection to wild populations, but flamingos in the wild can live up to 50 years. So there's a decent chance that Conchy will be seen sometime in the next 40 years. And Conchy validated the use of satellite transmitters, especially this particular model for American flamingos. As we were watching Conchy out in Florida Bay, I was working on creating some science that would help convince the state of Florida to change their perception of flamingos as a non-native species. So in 2018, we published a study in the journal The Condor that really provided all of our information on the kind of true history of flamingos in Florida. And this study got a lot of research, a lot of attention from the press in 2018. And one of the things that I thought was really impactful from that study is that shortly after, as the study was coming out, as journalists were asking us why FWC listed the flamingo as a non-native species, And as the journalists themselves were sending the article to FWC's offices, the website listing flamingos as a non-native species went from this to this. So uh, to me, that's an indication that science can be impactful and have relevance for policy. So we were really encouraged by this. And just after that research paper came out, we decided to request that the state of Florida, sorry, I've got a cat here. We requested the state of Florida actually list flamingos as a threatened species. And this is really important because it would really compel the state to take some action to protect flamingos. But this takes a very long time. So we submitted the petition in June of 2018. In December of that year, FWC said it cleared internal review, and they would move it on to the next stage in their listing process. And for that, the next stage is to bring in a panel of expert biologists and have them review the biology and make a recommendation to FWC about whether flamingos should be protected or not. They selected a great group of experts. The experts looked at the data for about 2 years, and ultimately the experts recommended that Florida list flamingos as a threatened species. However, when FWC reviewed the recommendation of experts, they ultimately decided to overrule the panel and not to list flamingos in Florida. And the reason for that was they said that there's just too few flamingos in Florida to warrant protection. They said there were less than 1,000 individuals in Florida, less than 1% of the global population occurs in Florida, which is certainly true. And they argue that there's existing protections and ongoing management in place. And there are existing protections, but I would argue there isn't really management for this species. So we were disappointed by this, but at least in the document that FWC produced for the biological status review report, this is the first time that Florida has ever really taken time to think about the issues of flamingos as a species to manage. This document says that FWC will coordinate monitoring, which is in their writing that they will do, and it's something that they haven't done yet. It also identifies some scientific knowledge gaps, so things that we need to know about flamingos that helps us guide our work moving forward. And it also, really interestingly, states that they may revisit this decision if something happens and the status of flamingos changes in Florida on the ground. So I wasn't going to be deterred by this decision. And instead, what I decided to do was bring together the panel of experts that FWC had hand collected and who all had suggested that flamingos should be protected. And we formed the Florida Flamingos Working Group. We decided that if the state of Florida wasn't going to come up with a plan to help flamingos return, we were just going to take it on ourselves. And so we assembled a panel of folks from Audubon, Florida, South Florida Wildlife Management District, the National Park Service, a number of zoos, the American Museum of Natural History, really a dream team of conservation experts and flamingo biologists dedicated to this cause. And this is the way we're thinking about our kind of big plans for flamingo population recovery. We've completed a few projects. We've completed our status and trends report and the telemetry of Conchy that really kind of sets the scientific foundation for population recovery. And we have some ongoing research that I mentioned that we expect to be done this year, both the genetics research and the work with stable isotopes. And then where we want to get to on the far right is population recovery. So the way we think about this is, what do we need to do to get from over here to over here? What kind of science do we need to inform conservation planning? And what kind of management actions do we need to really get flamingos back into the state? And so there were 3 real ways we thought that flamingos could return to Florida. This first one here up at the top Natural recolonization we thought was really unlikely. We thought it was unlikely that flamingos were going to come back on their own. But there were two other things that we had considered, but were going to be further into the future for options. One of those is facilitated recolonization through artificial nests. So one of the things that's worked in other parts of, with other species of flamingos, when the birds are present and people want them to nest in a certain area, is that biologists just make the artificial nests, the mud nests like flamingos make. And then the flamingos show up, they think to themselves, oh, this is a place where flamingos nest, and they make their own nests and lay eggs. So that's a pretty low-tech way to get to flamingos to nest in a place where you want them to. But a much more intensive option that we also think is further off into the future is actual reintroduction of birds from zoo-raised stock. So any of these could be options, but a few things that we need to know, especially before we start uh, start these more intensive interventions, is we need to understand what looks like good foraging habitat and what looks like good nesting habitats for flamingos, so we can really focus on protecting those areas, monitoring those areas, and studying the flamingos when we can. And then, of course, in 2023, we were not expecting this at all, but Hurricane Idalia swept through and blew in flamingos all over Florida and in much of the eastern US. So just as a kind of brief glimpse of how impactful Hurricane Idalia is, at the top, I have all of the eBird hits for American flamingos in North America in 2022. And at the bottom, I have all of the flamingos in 2023. So you can see there's a lot more in 2023. We still can't yet quantify this, but this is something that we're working on. And of course, many of you all probably know the story of Peaches, who was rescued off of Fort DeSoto, and Zoo Miami and Florida Audubon released the bird with a color band and a transmitter. But ultimately, Peaches was harassed away from Fort DeSoto, but last I know is still in Florida. And then we had been pushing for a long time to launch a campaign for flamingos to become the official state bird of Florida. Currently, as you all know, the mockingbird is a state bird, but as I started this talk with, flamingos are undoubtedly the most iconic bird in Florida. And so we had pushed for years for Zoo Miami and for some of our partners to launch a campaign to list flamingos as a state bird. And finally, this was decided that this year is the year. So a number of us in the Florida Flamingos Working Group wrote opinion pieces arguing to newspapers, arguing that flamingos should be the state bird. Zoo Miami's foundation hired a lobbyist to get this onto the Florida legislature. And there's currently bills both in the House and Senate that would make Florida the official, or make flamingos the official state bird. So that's where I'm going to end it for now. I want to thank you all for your time. We don't really know where this is going into the future, but I will say that we have come a very long way in about 8 years from considering flamingos a non-native species that wasn't on the conservation radar and wasn't on scientists' radar to something that's now recognized as a native species and under consideration as an official state symbol. So I'm happy to take any questions.
That was fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And you guys can either put it in the chat or just go ahead and ask your question. All right, we have a comment. Kim Root said, I stewarded Peaches after he was released at Fort DeSoto. How can we see where he is located currently?
So I think right now Zoo Miami is in charge of that data. And they haven't released it because they're worried that people are going to harass Peaches further. So I don't know of that. I don't have access to that data myself.
For the one for Pinky and St. Mark's, there were other flamingos that flew in with the dahlia. Did they stay and did they get together or not?
I think they did get together, but I think that Pinky has moved on. I don't think that Pinky has been seen in quite a while now. So it seems like once they all met, they went someplace else, and that's the best I can tell. So, but Pinky was there for 5 years, which is really incredible. Um, 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 when we were watching Conchy, we thought it was incredible that he was there for 2 years, but to see Pinky stay for 5 was even, I think, more impressive.
And Dan Backhouse was wondering, are there visual differences between the males and the females?
So the males tend to be a little bit larger, but it's not always easy to tell just from looking at them. When we measure them in a zoo or weigh them, we can tell, but it's not easy to tell just by looking at them. And there's a lot of overlap.
And then Cindy was wondering, the flamingos that are currently in Merritt Island, do you think they will stay?
I don't know. I am really hoping that the flamingos will stick around, they'll start to nest, they'll have successful offspring, and we'll have our native population of flamingos back. But I don't know. I don't know. Um, across the Caribbean, flamingos have been really slow to recolonize places they used to live. Their nesting locations have to be just absolutely perfect. They have to be close to a lot of food. Um, it has to be a place that won't flood so much that the nests flood. But they also can't dry out. Um, they can't dry out too soon, so the chicks have to go a long way to water.
Now, has the water levels affected, or do you think that's going to affect? Because I know we're having increased water levels.
So what we all think with, we think that flamingo recovery in Florida and restoration of the Everglades are tied together. So we expect as we push more water into the Everglades and replicate more of a natural water regime, we're going to see more and more flamingos because we get back to that kind of pre-disturbance state of the 1800s. So that's kind of what we're working with, and we think that Everglades restoration is just going to contribute to flamingo recovery.
And then Dee Simpson,
Actually, no, David.
That was me.
oh,
but-
David, that's David, sorry. Said several flamingos filtered through St. Mark's after the hurricane, and perhaps they convinced him to go home.
Yeah. It's
We didn't
They're
get a
really-
tracker on him in time, so we don't know. So,
yeah, unfortunately.
Now, how many were up there? Because aren't there 4 in Merritt Island right now?
there's 4, but there was 10 more seen recently too,
Oh, there's
actually.
10.
So,
Okay.
yeah, so, but at St. Mark's, they had, I think 11 different flamingos showed up at various times after the hurricane, because that was one of those spots that as flamingos are making their way back down from those northern areas to their native areas, St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge is one of those stopover spots that has good habitat, and just like Merritt Island Wildlife Refuge and the Mosquito Lagoon and New River Lagoon area and Fort DeSoto and Tampa Bay, there's there's a lot of habitats that serve as good stopover spots for these birds trying to find their way back home. So several went through St. Mark's, and they did see Pinky there at least, and he was seen kind of near the other flamingos. And so it may be that finally he got the idea. It's like, oh, maybe I should go back from wherever he came from. So
Mhm. And Elsie wanted to know, is there a difference in plumage color between wild versus captive flamingos?
Yeah, so their color comes from their diet, and captive birds can be paler or brighter than wild birds, depending on what they eat. For a long time, the flock at Hialeah wasn't fed a diet that was really rich in carotenoids, so they were really pale. And people thought that you could distinguish just based on looking at them, wild birds versus captive birds. I'm not sure that as a scientist, I wouldn't believe that information, um, because there is a lot. I've seen a lot of wild birds that seem pale. I've seen a lot of captive birds that are pale or bright. So I'm not sure how well that really falls out. It might apply for birds from Hylia, but not to all birds in captivity.
And Dina Pulver said there was a single sighting of a flamingo in Taylor County on January 4th.
Cool. Please, if you see flamingos, report them. I love eBird as a platform for science. That's really what we use to convince the state of Florida that the populations are here. And I just love that that data was available because people were out watching birds and reporting their observations. So FWC is not doing any monitoring for the species. It's people on the ground reporting their data on eBird, reporting their data to Audubon, Florida. That's really driving this conservation campaign. It's really a people-driven campaign. And regarding Pinky, I just don't know. I wish I could tell you more about the movement patterns of these birds, but it's just hard to know. It's hard to know.
And the movement to have it a state bird, where is that now?
So I think the House bill needs to get through one more committee, and the Senate bill, I believe, is good to go for a general vote. But if it doesn't get through the House, I'm not sure it'll get through the Senate. So if you're in favor of the flamingo as a state bird, reach out to your representatives, let them know how you feel, because the legislature is in session, but the clock is winding down.
Okay.
Very good. Now, do we know if there's any flamingos? Because I know they were seen very far up north. Have there been any reports that any of them are still up north of Florida?
No, I don't think so. I think that they've all moved. I think they've all moved south. Yeah. So flamingos are I was really surprised that Pinky stayed at St. Mark's for 5 years because there were a couple really big cold snaps there. But other species of flamingos, I think of flamingos as beachy and tropical, very much like Florida birds. But the South American species of flamingos live high up in the Andes. So they're in cold climates where the ponds freeze all the time. Oh wow. Um, um, Someone says there was a flamingo in Charleston in January. That's great. Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay, that one probably headed the wrong way.
Uh,
He went east, not south.
Can you tell us where the other six, well, the other 5 species are located?
So there's 2 species in the in Europe and Asia. So the greater flamingo is in the Mediterranean and in Africa, a little bit in Asia. The lesser flamingo is in Africa. And then there's 3 species of Andean highland flamingos in South America.
Hmm.
And the ones that live in the Andes are the ones that are most threatened with extinction. A lot of the highland environments that they rely on are mined for materials in our cell phones.
Oh,
So consuming lots of cell phones increases pressure on mining. So Chilean flamingos, what's the difference? Chilean flamingos are a little bit smaller. They're a little bit more compact. Um, but yeah, they do look very similar.
Very good. Any more questions?
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. Feel free to reach out by email. I'm always happy to talk more about flamingos, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you. Great talk. We love flamingos.
It was a great talk. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you.
Night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
all right.